Good afternoon and welcome to the third installment of the students portion of the President's Lecture Series on equity, race, and justice. We are extremely excited today. We have just concluded a lively presidential lecture series panel with our panelists, and now we have an opportunity to talk directly to students here at the University of Houston downtown. This section of our President's Lecture Series is tailored just for UHD students. In the spring, we will roll out a grant program where we're encouraging all of our students, graduate as well as undergraduate students, to work in teams with a professor and a member of the Houston community to discuss issues and programs that you can create around issues of equity and justice, anything from food equity to environmental equity to race equity to health equity. The sky is the limit. And during our lecture series, we want to highlight some members of our local and national community that's engaged in this work, and also allow our students an opportunity to expand their thinking around these issues. And so today we have this wonderful opportunity to expand the conversation around climate and environmental justice and sustainability. And we are going to engage in another lively session, and we ask that students in the audience ask questions, right? Pick our panelists' brains, take an opportunity, just really find out about how you can be more involved in the community. I am going to turn the panel over to our moderator for today, Natasha Poyo. She's a professor, an assistant professor of graphic design here at the University of Houston downtown in the Arts and Communication Department. She holds a Bachelor's of Fine Arts degree from the University of Buenos Aires and a Master's degree of Fine Arts from the University of Texas at Austin. Before joining UHD in 2018, she taught at Lamar University, and she also taught visual communication design at the University of Hartford in Connecticut. As a social impact design educator, she is a passionate advocate of the arts and design and social change. And so the President's Lecture Committee hand-selected Natasha to lead this panel because of her work in sustainability and in justice. And she spearheads award-winning projects to promote sustainable development and educational issues around global awareness. Her strategic work fosters interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, multi-level partnerships that brings positive change in local as well as international communities. And so I now turn it over to our moderator.
That was awesome. Thank you, Dr. Murray. All right. Okay, now I have a microphone that I don't have to hold, so I'm happy. So I'm going to do some introductions to our amazing panelists. So some of you were in the other session. For those who were not, I would like you to know who you have the privilege of listening to today. So I'll start first with Yvette Ariano. Is a Mexican-American Gulf Coast organizer and emerging leader from Houston dedicated to environmental and racial justice. Yvette formerly served as a policy research and grassroots advocate with Texas Environmental Justice Advocacy Services, that's a mouthful, and has founded an environmental justice advocacy group based in Houston, Texas called Fence Line Watch. Fence Line Watch is dedicated to the eradication of toxic multi-generational harm on communities living along the fence line of industry. In 2015, they led the campaign against HR 702, which opened the floodgates to U.S. crude oil exports. They were instrumental in the publication Double Jeopardy in Houston, Air Toxics and Health in the Houston community of Manchester, and Plastic and Health, The Hidden Cost of a Plastic Planet. Keep saying the same wrong word. This report highlights the disproportionate toxic impact of the petrochemical industry on communities living on the fence line. Welcome, Yvette. Next, we have Ayana Jolivet McLeod, is the executive director of Bayou City Waterkeeper, where she works on wetland protection and urban water management, promotes nature-based system centered in equity, and supports community efforts to improve water quality. Before joining BCWK, she worked at Houston Botanical Garden as Director of Education and Public Programs, overseeing the launch of the organization's first ever educational offerings. You're in the right spot here. She's also an interdisciplinary artist, hello art, and occasionally writes and makes art about nature, diaspora, and equity. Ayana has led programs and mobilized resources at environmental and cultural institutions for over 20 years. She frames new ways of imagining and advocating for natural resources and environmental justice, which center creativity, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, and ecological diversity. Welcome to UHD. Next, we have Ms. Bridget Murray, who established the nonprofit organization Achieving Community Tasks Successfully, also known as ACTS, in 2012 to support community activities in the areas of social and environmental justice. ACTS established the first Texas community-led air monitoring network in 2019, hosting 7 low-cost air monitors. I can't believe it's the first one. Wow, that's amazing. ACTS is, as a community-based organization, works with the local community schools, establishing urban gardens, and providing support for robotics and drone education. You know, drones, that's cool, right? Their work is supported through the application of citizen science to engage the community to be a part of the solution, using data to support change. Welcome, Ms. Murray. And finally, we have Ms. Stephanie Badiga, is Air Alliance, Houston's Advocacy and Legal Director. She serves as an advocate before local, state, and federal courts and administrative bodies for AAH and the communities that they serve. Stephanie also provides in-house legal counsel and is developing an AAH Environmental Justice Leadership Lab. Stephanie holds a master's in public health from Georgia State University and a Juris Doctorate from Texas Southern University Thurgood Marshall School of Law. Before AAH, she worked for Harris County Public Health as a policy analyst, and prior to that, interned with the Lone Star Legal Aid. Welcome, Stephanie. All right, well, I'm very excited to have you all here again. So welcome to UHD, and we're going to have like a great time to have some questions. And first of all, I have, for all of you to start, you have like about 5 minutes to answer what is your background, which is, I went over the bio, but like more in depth, and how did you get into this work? So let's start with you, Yvette.
Oh, I did that thing you said. My name's Yvette Ariano, and I'm lived in Houston my entire life. I come from a Spanish first-speaking family, and both of my parents are migrants. They migrated over in the 60s to Houston. I grew up over near Acres Homes, and then transplanted over to the east end of Houston. I graduated from the University of Houston's main campus in political science, and honestly, now working in environmental justice, the one thing I have to say to you is it doesn't matter what you graduate in, as long as you pursue bettering our communities in any way, form, or fashion. And I sit on 4 boards: the Center for International Environmental Law, Backbone Campaign, an art and activism group, the Green Latinos, which is a Latino formation at the federal level that works on green policy, and Peak Plastic Foundation that is looking to curb the impacts of plastic on our fence line communities. And my passion for driving in this work is I'm personally affected by reproductive justice issues due to the impacts of a toxic environment. And my community strongly suffers from the inability of being able to reproduce, which is a right. So I come at this from a human rights perspective, and I believe that EJ is a human rights issue.
Hi everyone, I'm Stephanie. So my background, I'm born to Nigerian parents. I'm Nigerian. I was born there, partially raised there. But I grew up in Portland, and so I always tell everyone I'm from Oregon, but I'm new to Houston. I've been here a little over 3 years. In the context of environmental work, I think it just came from gaining information. I had shared in the other room earlier. It wasn't my intention necessarily to work in environmental law. I thought I was going to be working in transactional law, which is like business and contracts and things like that. And I think as I started to kind of learn about cancer clusters and landfills and emissions and all the petrochemical complexes that we have here in Houston, I just decided that this is something that was very passion-filled for me, and especially learning how disproportionate these impacts are and how intentional they are kind of garnered my work here.
Hi, everyone. So it's wonderful to hear people's backgrounds and like how long we've been in Houston, and like some of us are immigrants. I mean, for me, I'm a native Houstonian. I come from a working class background, and actually I'm a fourth generation artist. And I went to school for arts. And I also simultaneously have worked for about 20 plus years in nonprofit administration and 10 years in nonprofit management. I've mostly worked in cultural institutions, and in the past 5 years kind of shifted towards environmental work, because I felt like there was limits in working in arts institutions where I wanted to see deeper change and impact. I've always been interested in mapping, which is quite abstract, but just a sense of space to understand like how we engage and interact with land and space. And so some of my creative work is very similar to kind of landscape design. It's work that's on the land. It's very influenced by indigenous and Afro-diasporic connections to land. My connection to the work is, I said this before, was I really was sparked by Harvey, and I really kind of wanted to do deeper work around the inequities that our city is experiencing and how we're creating solutions around flood recovery and flood inequities that we experience. On the flip side, I'm also really inspired by aquatic habitats and understanding that we live in a semi-tropical region, and so there's so much nature that is inspired by our waterways, and so I love to just learn and nerd out about the aquatic habitats that our region supports.
Sufficient for you all to hear me? Okay, great. So my name is Bridget Murray. I guess I can share that I'm probably on my 5th career. As a registered nurse, I worked in many different areas: hospital, law firms, then moving into managed care, and finally retiring from MD Anderson Cancer Center. So I feel pretty confident that when I decided to start a nonprofit organization, ACTS, that I was really looking at that retirement plan. And so that's been the focus for me since I've retired from nursing. But healthy living has always been a part of what I'm about. And so ACTS became that vehicle to continue in that vein. So as a nonprofit with a focus on both social justice and environmental justice, we have worked on things like food insecurity, directly supporting communities with food access, as well as working with schools for gardens. Also, the air monitoring network that we started in 2019. So we've been supportive of many different things, and as we continue to talk, I'll even share some of the recent work that we completed during this pandemic, where we actually conducted a survey in communities in our particular area, where we're looking at disaster recovery, preparedness, as well as health outcomes. So those are some of the things that we've been working on as a organization.
Wonderful. Well, because this is a student session, we are like looking forward to hearing questions from you. So first, before I have some questions of my own, but if any of you have like a pressing question right now that maybe carried, yes.
So there are like many developed schools and undeveloped schools. And so we're talking about the environment. I come from a sport called soccer, and I played on terrible fields. And I always wondered, why is these fields horrendously done? But then you can see other schools that have well done fields, clean, neat, everything. But then there's schools that I went to where there's like nothing there, no grass, just dirt, nothing. Just the two little goalposts.
Wonderful. Well, I'm excited to hear that you play soccer because I'm Argentinian, so I know what you're talking about. Yes. So our student, what's your name? Muhammad. Muhammad, he asked that he plays soccer and he plays in fields that are not nice, right? That they are not maintained or they lack their nourishment in that soil to be like a proper soccer field. So, and he sees other ones that are like nice and well maintained, and so he's concerned. And what are your ideas? What are your thoughts about that?
You know, I hate it when people refer me to a book, but here it goes. The Color of Law is actually a wonderful read, and Houston is part of that story. The piece of the story is talking about redlining and how Houston actually helped establish these racially charged discriminatory practices and embedded them in our systems and our institutions. So basically saying, hey, here's an entire city, you know, instead of saying we'll chop off this part for industrial use and over here is where people get to live so they live healthy lives. Our city, which doesn't believe in zoning and making those zones, instead said, here are these really polluted, not great parts of the city. Let's stick all of our Black, brown, and other folks in these areas because, you know, we can develop the rest of it for business and to generate wealth. So that's one part of Houston's history at creating these discriminatory practices, making sure that our people weren't given loans in communities in order to buy homes in nicer areas, loan and realty and development offices not showing people of color communities and houses in communities that are better off, right, and trying to all push us into one area. The second part and the more recent part of this story is that Houston, unlike so many of the cities in the U.S., establishes TIRZ, Tax Increment Reinvestment Zones. And those zones are supposed to basically trap all of the property taxes. Imagine this, every single year, property taxes go up, right? Naturally. There's a baseline of property tax, but every single year, that tax increases by just a little bit. That little bit that it increases gets put into a pot of money. And then that pot of money is called a TIRZ, or it creates a tax increment reinvestment zone. Those monies get put into beautification projects. Like, have you ever noticed that in the Galleria area, they have those giant metallic street signs that are beautiful? The medians have flowers all the time that look pretty nice. Whereas you go on our side of Houston, it doesn't have any of that. That's because the TIRZ pay for those developments, and they're taking that amount of property tax to go into those beautifications. So what happens when you put a bunch of rich people together? They have a lot more tax money to go into those projects. So instead of the city saying, let's grab the monies and distribute them evenly and equitably, instead it says, no, this is the tax money for this zone. It pays for the projects in this zone. And that's something that needs to change.
I'll also say that what you're basically speaking to is that acknowledging inequities and access to green space. And so that's a really important foundation to establish that when you go into so many different neighborhoods, and especially in Houston, we are the most diverse city in the country. We hear it all the time. But what does that mean in terms of inequity? And also, I always say we are one of the most ecologically diverse cities in the country. So who has access to that green space? to this green renaissance. We have all these green spaces, but those are concentrated in certain places. And so I think it's really, I really love that observation, like, because you are connected to something you love, soccer, and to just see the green space and like the inequities in that green space is very powerful. I think that what you're bringing up is this kind of conversation from a planner's perspective, and Mitch Silver in New York did a talk here. You should check him out, and he talked about park inequities. For me, what I'd like to say is, let's talk about where we grew up or where we live right now. Let's talk about the playground in the school playgrounds. There's so many playgrounds that are in vulnerable communities and black and brown communities. They don't even have green space. They have a slab of concrete. And so for you to talk about a park such as that, that's an example of that. That is because of years of divestment, and that is one access point for you to see what environmental justice looks like, or environmental injustices looks like, because those same communities are the same communities where they have histories of landfills and histories of dumping, and so it's so interesting to sort of map out these inequities in our country and in our city, but to just to see the lack of inequity in green space, especially as we talk about Houston. And again, everyone talks about this green renaissance that's happening, but let's be real and talk about who is not being served and what we see in our immediate communities.
Yeah, and go to the city planner and tell them that you want to establish a TERS and get 4 other friends and then say, we are the TERS Council, and get that project, grab that money, because if the community doesn't grab it, another community can ask for permissions to take your community's money.
Wow, that's pretty revealing. Yes, over there.
All right, so I have a question. I need to direct this for her because she might have some background in relation to health. Some of you guys talking. So, in relation to health and environmental equity, what trends have been prominent, and have you established any direct correlations to either issue?
So we have the benefit now of a little over 18 months of data related to the air quality information that we've captured regarding our community. If I didn't say it, let me share now. Our community is about 2.2 miles from the Houston Ship Channel. 610 freeway is my backyard. Anheuser-Busch is right across the street. I could go on and on. We're very industrialized in that area. And grant you, when you look at the data, we are not exceeding the standard in a 24-hour basis, but our information is sharing, though, that generally from 68 to 80% of the time, air quality is above 8 in our community. So these are the kinds of trends that we're seeing in our community that will say to us that overexposure for people with respiratory conditions can impact heart conditions, neurological conditions, that these are the things that we must share directly with our community. And we're also pursuing other monitoring so that we can capture more than just particulate matter. But particulate matter 2.5 is very important information. Did that answer your question?
Also, you should all know that the city of Houston has never met Clean Air Act standards. From Harris County all the way to Brazoria, there are 8 counties that make up one of the largest. It's called a non-attainment zone, means we haven't met that standard. The Houston Ship Channel committee that monitors this actually just celebrated meeting 1995's standard. Who here was born 1995 or sooner? Exactly. There you go. No, congratulations. But you and I and all of you have never been able to breathe clean air, and that's a shock, and most Houstonians actually do not know that. It's a human rights violation, in my opinion, to expose us to that kind of pollution, and not only pollution, but toxic pollution that can live in our bloodstreams and that we will inherit to our children if and when we choose to do so.
And if I can just add, in terms of health impacts as well, so there's been a few studies, I don't know I guess, what a favorite study, but Brookings, Harvard, they've done a few studies about the COVID impact with air quality, right? And so folks who live in these industrialized communities are dying at larger rates than folks who don't, right? And that's because of, like you were mentioning, the particulate matter, the ozone, everything. It affects the way you breathe, the way you live, the things you eat. And then when you compound that with other, consequences of racism, and I know in our initial question, we kind of danced around the idea, but the issue with that green space, I just want to make sure that we're naming it, those are consequences of racism, right? Those redlinings, those are all consequences of racism. We just tend to try to, avoid the language, but at some point you have to call it what it is. And so in terms of health impacts, when you kind of already look at the different communities who suffer these health impacts, we know that Black and brown people have lower, health benefits, health expectations, life expectancy. And during this COVID period, I think we lost like 3 years off of Black and brown folks' life expectancy. And when you put everything together, you're like, well, I live next to this, metal manufacturing place that's emitting all these, hazardous air pollutants. Of course, your lung capacity is going to decrease and your ability to fight off these infections, go down. So I think that's another piece that people aren't really seeing is like, okay, there's this pandemic and we know that, Black and brown people are dying more, but no one wants to name why. And, this is one of the main reasons why.
Yeah, and I'll say too, so with Bayou City Waterkeeper, we were established 20 years ago around the Clean Water Act. And so you would think in a city that is called Bayou City with 14,000 miles of bayous that we would have access to clean water. But that's a huge health issue, which I'm working on building out the framework of kind of the work that we do around health inequities. We do a lot of work in fighting for clean water, whether that's pollution of the water, whether that's, I mentioned before, we just had a record-breaking victory where we sued City of Houston because communities were experiencing sanitary sewer overflows, and so backup of sewage because of failing water infrastructure. And so the city is now required, and that was after 5 years of research on behalf of our organization in collaboration with others. So now the city is required to amend the water infrastructure and fix it using $2 billion. So that's a huge health issue of just dealing with sewer flows in your community. The other piece is that just for us, we all live in a watershed. And so we forget that we live in a watershed and we all have the right to a healthy watershed. There are some mitigation aspects that our wetlands that we have that are in our prairies that are native to our city, that they do a lot for us, but we have those being knocked down by developers, and those cause all kinds of health inequities as well. And so that's another piece too. And then the final piece is, let's be real, like Harvey happened 5 years ago, and there's still people that are dealing with health issues and recovering from Harvey too. And so how do we organize and mobilize around flood recovery and to protect our most vulnerable communities, and so that their health, we are protecting their health. So that's kind of what we are thinking about.
I saw like a hand raise. Yes.
I just had a brief question. You were discussing your inspirations for your art. You used a specific word prior to speaking on indigenous people. It's like Afro something. I just wanted to attach a definition to that term because I picked it up and it's just like.
Yeah. So I'm really inspired by African diasporic art making, and it's basically, this feels so off topic, but it also like how we think about land and ecology and as stewards of the land and environmental justice. I hope that this can shift the narrative. We're all stewards, and so in indigenous kind of, indigenous histories and creative kind of placemaking and African diasporic histories, there's a centering of land that is happening. And for me, I've done some research and travels and looking at, I went to Haiti and did some research on just this drawing on the land and looking at African Americans and our histories, but like understanding these different traditions of connecting to land creatively that are, there's some interesting parallels in the diaspora.
Yes.
Sorry for interrupting, but I have minor sustainability, so as a student like me, how would we be able to interact with your organization? How would we be able to make that connection where, because it's one thing where our university has created a sustained scholars program, where us as students, we're tasked with creating a solution to a problem that we might see around campus. For example, the one me and my group have been currently working on was establishing a charging station outside of the eating area. In order to charge your phone, you have to go find an outlet, and it's very difficult. But there's plenty of spaces where you can easily install a solar panel and a charging station. And that's what we're doing right now. We're literally about to wrap it up and submit it and finish it, actually install it. But that's only so much that we can do here at the school. My question is, how could we be able to interact with maybe your organization? How would we establish that connection with you guys on a bigger scale? Because it's one thing to work on a smaller scale, and another thing to make it really large or active.
There's eager opportunities for internships here.
You can always, as founder and director of Fence Line Watch, feel free to follow us on all social medias except Instagram at fencelinewatch.org, on Twitter at fencelinewatch. And we're also on Facebook, where we basically bring information on the latest false solutions, because what you're talking about is creating a true solution to an issue you're experiencing, a lack of charging stations. So linking that up with a solar panel system and getting ahead of a false solution curve would be one way that we could help elevate that. And touching on false solutions and indigenous sort of led platforms, I know we keep on hearing about just transitions, like we need to transition over to a green economy, we need to transition over now, and that's great. But we have to be mindful that the opportunities for a just transition hit people who are most affected, meaning we need to create, instead of pipelines for oil and gas, pipelines for renewable careers that start at the community college and the high school level. Because if we don't open those opportunities, we're losing a population that will eventually be absorbed in temporary work for oil and gas facilities and further harm their health. These jobs look like everything from mariners who go off, right? You have to be on platforms at 4 a.m. with the potential of getting a job, only temporarily. If you manage to get a temporary job, that's 2 weeks on, 1 week off at 18-hour shifts. If you're working 18 hours straight, you're gonna become exhausted. There's gonna become a heavier reliance on illicit drugs. More and more mistakes happening at refineries and petrochemical facilities. So really calling us towards not a net zero emissions plan, but a true zero, and cutting out all toxic emissions, curbing false solutions, saying, no, we don't want nuclear energy to come into Houston. We don't want our waters to become like those in The Simpsons with three-eyed fish, right? Because we've already opened the floodgates to radioactive waste in our state, in Tyler, Texas. And so these are red flags that are starting to come up. We talk about carbon capture and the opportunities in the plan to capture carbon. These facilities look like an oil refinery, and they use more energy than they actually take up carbon. So linking what you're working on, recharging stations, with true renewables and away from hydrogen, nuclear, and this false idea that we can buy out our way of this issue is important.
May I also suggest that, we're a very small nonprofit, and one of the recent grant applications that we submitted was to ask the funder to consider supporting the idea of creating a pipeline in Houston community colleges or universities where students are taught analytics and can help support community-based organizations. Since we started our air monitoring program in 2019, we're being asked by other nonprofit groups, other communities who also have an interest because they feel that they're being exposed to the air toxics, and they want to be able to create their own air monitoring. But it's not something that you just jump into. You have to have support staff. We've been privileged enough to identify a candidate at UT Public Health who's working on her PhD. So she's been doing all of our analytics. Because of our working organization, working with EDF, TSU, some other organizations, we find ourselves at least 2 to 3 times a month meeting to continue to understand the maintenance and what's happening with these air monitors. So I think that there are a lot of communities, EJ groups, who are looking for support, and then putting our heads together to figure out how we can support them to do some of the things that they would like to do on behalf of their community. So I'm more than happy to share my email address with you, the whole group if you like it. And
Yeah, I'm sure that they would be interested.
And I'll just say we're also small too. We might be a little bit bigger than y'all, but maybe just a little bit. But I'll say we're happy if you know, in terms of, sometimes it's really just a matter of like reminding people of, again, this work is so big. And so if you just need a resource and just making those connections around from the water issue, I'm happy to just maybe just have a conversation and just suggest, yes.
The reason why I was interested in you because when I first started at university, I also did some water quality testing with microbiology. So whenever you mentioned the toxins being found in the water, I actually ended up finding particularly matters in the water as well, along with the E. coli level was very high. And that wasn't even the water from the bayou, it was literally from the runoff from close to where I live, and I live in the East Area of Houston.
Right. Yeah, well, we know that there's a hierarchy in the bayous. We talk about the beautiful bayous that we have in our city, but you know that there's a hierarchy in the bayous. We do not do water quality testing, but what we're trying to do is build out framework of how we use that data, and if there's any sort of community science program. We're still in this exploratory phase, but I'm happy to connect you with people because we have access to scientists that are doing the work, and if there's any way, if you're interested in sort of building out that framework, again, that's the main thing, is that you are doing the work in this kind of small, in this, and not that it's not impactful, but if there's a way that we can help you connect the dots, to have other narratives, to talk to someone that's doing that, to do a spotlight on someone that's in the field, just to remind people, this is what this looks like in action, we're happy to collaborate in that way.
And now hearing that you're doing some of that, we have connections with the Magnolia Civic Center who do regular water testings in the area, just like what you just did. So being able to connect you to them would be great because it's a part of a TCQ-funded program that needs more participation.
That's great. You had a question, right?
Can you speak a little bit louder? Yeah. Amongst like the general public, when I talk about my peers and like the less, the people who are just like working in these factories, there is a sense that they can't really afford to care about the future of our planet because they need to take care of their children, right? So like, especially with the rise of like, a lot of people seem to be indifferent towards the health of our planet so long as they can get a leg up, or if they're just like, I don't know if they're ignorant to it or just apathetic with these non-fungible tokens. There are these things that take a ridiculous amount of energy to produce, and yet so many people are hopping on this train just hoping to collect a quick buck, right? So how do we address that sort of either, I don't know, this apathy or ignorance? How do we address that? Because it seems like so many people just either don't know or don't care.
I didn't expect this conversation to come up, but I'm glad that it did because, the NFTs have had this rise. NFTs, crypto, digital consumership have become extremely popular. And the idea there is, well, I'm not producing anything. I'm not extracting from the earth to create, a cell phone or any other commodity, right? So I can't be generating waste. But if you rework it and do the narrative work that you just did with us right now, people start changing their perspective. And I don't think enough people have the information that you're talking about. Because whether it's snapping a picture of something we don't care about that gets stored away and uses an immense amount of energy and water to even keep a photo that you're never going to look back at, or generating NFTs, the information behind how much energy is actually being used is not there. I was shocked to know that Houston, we didn't breathe clean air, right, since the establishment of the Clean Air Act. That was a shock to me. I don't think that people who work inside of petrochemical, oil, and gas facilities are apathetic, or maybe not all apathetic, to our environment, but I don't think that they so much consider the cost it's taken on them. Because when you have a petrochemical facility worker who goes home, takes off their clothes, washes their clothes in a washer, whether it's a laundromat like the ones I go to or one that you have in your home, you're washing your baby's clothes, you're washing your family's clothes in there, those toxics are transferring on your clothes. Whenever they go to work, they're on ground zero. In fence line, frontline communities, we understand that ground zero is inside of the facilities. And inside of the facilities, there's a process where if you see something, say something. And that's how they do safety protocol. So if nobody says that there is a gas leak, a valve is off its rocker, then nobody knows. And eventually we get to situations where there was an ITC explosion. It was 7 days long. We were exposed to thousands, hundreds of thousands of toxics, including cancer-causing benzene. The fact that the county came out, the EPA, the TCQ, in a unified formation and said that we won't see the impacts of those toxics that were released until 10 years from now, explains a little bit over why people don't have the urgency behind let's take care of the situation now. Because in my experience, talking and knocking on doors, trying to get people out to meetings, sometimes the response is, if I were dead, wouldn't I be dead right now? And it's not about dying. It's not about having cancer. It's about a life, living a life of dignity that we deserve, a life where we're not spending hundreds of dollars on air filtration systems subsidizing the industry. Because I know at least one person in Manchester who spends $1,000 every month on a filtration system that costs $3,000. And she is not in a place where she could be spending that kind of money on simply filtering her water. The amount of times you go into emergency care systems because of asthmatics like my partner at home, where we have no health care coverage, we have no insurance, in a state that doesn't value health care for all, is an issue. But if the state doesn't care, if the city doesn't care, if local municipalities or smaller governments don't care, then how does that transfer on to the way we see our lives? And we begin to start forming this, well, why should I care, or why should I know? So I generally think that there's an issue with a lack of information, because from my side of the advocacy, now doing this since 2014, 2015, most people have no idea what we're exposed to. And there isn't a push or an effort to get that information out. And it's shrouded by so many different layers of bureaucracy, from the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality and post 9/11 and the Patriot Act, and how much it established under Homeland Security.
To that.
Go ahead.
So kind of to that effect, though, I also, I echo her points. I just also want to point out that when folks are working in these facilities, most time that's like their only form of income, right? And so that's not to say like they're doing the right thing, but I think understanding the larger context of it, these same facilities are also donating to the high schools that they're essentially damaging, right? And so when you start to think about like, oh, well, if I speak up now, that funding could be withdrawn. They're going to all together decide they want to pull that funding. So for me, I think the bigger issue is the industries, right? It's these facilities. Like, no matter, I think I shouldn't have to be able to like choose like, oh, well, I don't want to work here because I know you're killing our neighborhood. But okay, well, now that I'm not working, now what's going to happen with me and my family? So I think that for me, the larger context is the facilities. It's why are you putting these communities in a position where they're having to choose between a livelihood and, like you were saying, their dignity, essentially. And I think that that's the larger, I guess from my standpoint, that's the larger issue, is how can we hold these facilities accountable for the things that they're doing so that these people can still continue to work in these facilities, but they can be safe and not bring that damage home to their family, if that makes sense.
The one other point I'll bring up is, are y'all familiar with Boston Dynamics? They brought out robot dogs, right? Cop dogs. Well, Boston Dynamics is also behind a massive push inside of oil, gas, and petrochemical industries to make mundane and more, I guess, professional jobs on oil rigs, on platforms that are gas terminal platforms, to make them automatic. That narrative is being lost. The same way that car manufacturing went completely dominated by technology, service workers got nixed out by pay stations, is the same that's happening inside of our industrial complexes. And so workers keep on thinking it's between my job and my life. But where's the narrative that says that job's not going to be around for very much longer? Because if that facility, if that industry can nix you out, not pay your retirement, your pension, your health care, your income for a $100,000 dog that you pay once, that can do inspections, that can drill boreholes under the ocean, and you don't have to sacrifice any people and create a narrative of safety around it, then where's that information? Again, we're gonna become obsolete as people inside of oil and gas, and we need to get that story out there. It's not about people, it's not about jobs, it's about the bottom dollar for oil, gas, and petrochemicals.
And just briefly, I think we all have to take into consideration the issue of misinformation. Misinformation has been with us for a very long time. You know, if you want to think about, and I don't know, I may be dating myself, all of you may not have even been around when when the cigarette industry fought against all of the data that showed that it was cancer causing. Yeah. But when you have the money, you basically can control the narrative. And so these are some of the things that we have to fight in these situations. And so education and training is a lot of what we're engaged in, because you have to educate the people about a lot of the misinformation that's out there. And then the word mitigation. We understand, well, let me say I understand that if I want, clean water, I'm gonna have to understand that we have to start with the word mitigation, because these companies are not going to make that big change overnight. So we have to work towards mitigation as well as fighting the misinformation.
Yeah, and I'll say personally, this is something I was torn with myself, like just coming from a working class background and, being around activists and folks that had, multiple college degrees or family that went to college and had all this big picture knowledge. And for me, I was just like, I'm dealing with people that are just dealing with day-to-day life with, don't have a good, healthy grocery store in the neighborhood, or personally dealing with violence and death in my own proximity. And, just trying to deal with action around these issues can be quite overwhelming. I think that at the same time, don't underestimate the power of community and everyday folks, because don't assume that people are so overburdened by work that they cannot create action. And so that is how so much action has happened. Some like Clean Water Act, even though that was mostly a white-led kind of grassroots, that was mostly kind of white-led. It still was everyday fisher folks that were like trying to protect their rivers, and they realized that the state of the waterways were a mess and that we had to shift things. And so there's a lot of history a lot of what we're doing is building on the foundation of grassroots activism, of folks that are in the community that said enough is enough. So for me, I think that what's really helpful is to acknowledge the agency of the people around you, in starting with yourself and your family, and actually acknowledge that they might be making small shifts and wanting to make those small shifts. I also agree about acknowledging the importance of folks like us that are actually holding industry accountable too, because this is an ecosystem in which we all work to enforce environmental justice. And so the way that it looks, the way that we can hold on to hope is to acknowledge the different levels of work that is happening. And you know, I will also go back to this idea of community science. It's also known as citizen science, but we call it community science. There's a lot of power in community science, something such as the program of the air monitoring project that was launched. That is an example of community science. And so this history of community science is quite powerful because basically we said, science is quite hierarchical, that we actually have the power to monitor our communities and our environment, and we can create change. And it starts with one person. So there's models out there, and I would actually counter your argument and say, maybe see the agency and the power of the people around you, and folks are exasperated, and folks are creating change and want to create change, and there's histories of that.
We have time for one question.
One more question. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, I had so many questions, but that's one. So I come from a Hispanic background. My grandfather on my mother's side came to the U.S. when my mom was in like high school. And I remember going to my grandpa's house when I was a kid. The way I knew that we were close is I would see all the refineries. And for me now, being older and educating myself on environmental science, you know, I see that, but for my grandfather, that's just what he kind of always knew. And so I was wondering, how do you begin to have that conversation with someone who maybe, you know, that's their reality, it's just, you know, that's just what they think, you know, is normal. And we hear terms like climate anxiety, you know, how do you avoid that kind of like impending doom thing and stay positive but also realistic?
There's a difference between creating the idea of hopelessness and then stating urgency. And what we need in this time is to create a state of urgency for action. And the truth is, we were given a limit, right? We were given 1.5 degrees. That's as high as we can get. We're at 1.1 degrees right now, as it stands. If we cut all emissions out, within the next couple of years, we would exceed 1.5 degrees. So the idea that we're not there, we saw Texas freeze over in February, right? Everybody felt that. Your grandfather felt that, you felt that, I felt that, we all felt that. And we all experienced it in different ways. So the fact that we never have gotten through a freeze of that size lays out an argument for climate chaos and disaster that's impending. And it's important for us to acknowledge that it's coming and be prepared, because like Bridget said, if we have information, we can prepare for that, right? We can see what's coming, and I'd rather see the train that's coming down the dark tunnel than not see it and it hit me. So making sure that we become aware of what are the changes happening now. How can we prepare our families, whether it's developing evacuation routes, which your grandfather would be familiar with because that exists in Pasadena, Baytown, Channelview, throughout. I see a facility, I see Lyndale Basel out of my front window every single day. And so it's important for me to have that plan, that evacuation, check in on my neighbors whenever we have these massive disasters. So getting information together, almost like you would a fire safety kit, right? And then moving towards a conversation where it's, yeah, we know we're going to move into an era of water scarcity. Scarcity is impending. Let us protect what we have now. Let us work with the water keepers and find out, hey, how can we protect our water systems, make sure that the city is on top of not having situations where industrial backwash flushes in to our municipal water systems, right? Because we've all probably experienced boil water notices. Trying to get prepared for shelter in place and assuring that all of the people in our community know how to do that properly. Because the more and more we practice systems of care and self-care and preparation, the more our communities get to challenge back these major facilities when they're like, well, we'll get the information to you eventually. No, I need that information now. I've spent now $300 on a prep kit. Am I gonna be subsidized? Do we need to establish that for our communities? Do we need to establish toxic alert systems like we do for, we just had the World Series. How many of us got the text saying X freeway is closed? Happened during the Super Bowl. It happened during the freeze. Why didn't we get those same things during the chemical hazards, notifications that X routes are closed? So I think we need to start pushing more towards, we know what's gonna happen, let's prepare ourselves for it.
Yeah.
On the,
Sorry, can I just add something to that? And in terms of communication, I think language is probably now, I don't know if I should call it a barrier, but I think we have all these new terminologies for all these new words, and people are kind of,
Yes.
I think it's important to meet people where they are, right? I think it's important to use language that resonates with folks, like instead of, trying to, keep in term with all the acronyms that we use every day, just meet people where they're at. And I think sometimes, kind of like you were mentioning, sometimes we might not be able to get the breakthrough that we're looking for, but the best that we can do is to prepare them, right? So if you just wanted to have a conversation, be like, do you know what would happen if we had to leave right this second? What would you do, right? Like those type of conversations where it's like you're kind of recognizing like, okay, this person is here and I'm having a hard time getting them here. So what can I do in the meantime to bridge that gap? And that usually looks like preparation, like getting them some form of information that they understand, they can digest, and they now know what to do with. So even though it's not exactly what we need them to do, we know that we've put them in the best position that we can possibly get them into.
well, on that note, I would like to, end this wonderful panel with this wonderful audience with amazing questions. You all kill it. It was like, yeah, I had questions prepared, and I was like, wow, those questions are much better. So thank you very much for being here. Let's give a round of applause to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.